Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us here at SDHistCon Winter Quarters 2026. My name is Andrew Bucholtz. I'm part of the SDHist board, and I'm here with Volko Ruhnke, the designer of 1943 Race to Rabaul, as well as many other great games that you'll know him from. But this is the one we're here to talk about today. And Volko, I don't know. Do you want to just introduce this by talking about what led to you designing this game?
Thanks, Andrew. Hi, all. Sure. So I was in Prague 2 Septembers ago for CzechCon, for the first Czech War Game Con, hosted by Peter Mojic. And I had the good fortune there to meet and get to know a little bit Jaro Andriškovič, who is one of the two principals, along with Valdemar Gumeni, of Phalanx Games. And just talking about game design, with Jaro, he asked me if I would like to do a design with them, with Phalanx. And I have been a big fan of the Phalanx Race to systems, Race to the Rhine, 1944 Race to the Rhine, and then 1941 Race to Moscow, and especially Race to the Rhine, which I have played a lot. And if you, for anybody who knows my live-in campaign system for medieval ancients, you'll know that I'm into showing logistical systems, including with just actual bits, not just supply lines and supply effects, but actual bits of stuff that are moving around the map to track logistics, and which is what Race to the Rhine is all about. And so I thought, wow, if I was going to do a game with Phalanx, I would want to do something in that system. And then bouncing off Coast Watchers, I have, for a long time, even before that, been very interested, just fascinated by the South Pacific campaign in World War II. And in the research for Coast Watchers in particular, was just fascinated by the logistical challenges that the Japanese faced. So I thought, well, that seems like a natural partnership for me and Phalanx, is to take their race to logistical system into the South Pacific.
Yeah, that's a good note. And you mentioned levy and campaign and how that had you thinking about logistics and supplies a lot. How would you say this system is similar or different? Obviously, it's a different era, but how does it treat supply?
Yeah. So here's the main similarity that makes me mention levy and campaign in conjunction with Phalanx Race to blank. There are a number of ways that war games, going back to at least Africa Corps, right? So going way back, have mechanically simulated supply, stock and flow of stuff, movement, not just combat, but movement of stuff. And in the maritime context, movement of land units, right? You can't just have your army march across the water. You have to ship stuff, including men and weapons and stuff. Anyway, so the movement of stuff and the accounting for how much stuff you have. So we talk about stock and flow models, right? Stock is how much stuff, flow is where is it going, right? That in war games has been simulated in various ways for decades. One of those ways that is particularly direct as a model, is particularly articulated, is to actually have bits on the map that show, here's the stuff. So an example of that might be the Gamers Africa, where North Africa is just, logistics is really important as a bottleneck. And so in North Africa World War II games, you tend to do a lot of explicit modeling of supply. It's worth the rules. And so in Africa, even though it's a simple game, a really complicated one is I guess DAC is Tunisia system, and OCS, same company. Anyway, there are little counters, markers that say 1, 2, 3, that are the supplies, the fuel and weapons for the forces. And you can move them around the map. You can see where they are. You can count them. You can use them up gradually, and you can strike them. You can do counter logistical, And all of that is like another simpler way you might do that in a war game is supply lines. You just say, well, if I can trace this road back to the off the map, I'm fine. If not, my units are impaired in some way. Here in Africa and in Lebanon campaign and in Race to the Rhine or Race to Moscow, we have actual bits on the map that account for how much supply stuff and where is it. And I just found that a lot of fun in Africa and also in Road to the Rhine. And so I wanted to explore logistics in the medieval context and Libyan campaign. So I had to have that. I just had to have, in that case, in Libyan campaign, it goes a little bit further because it's not just how much stuff, how much, in this case, provender, or how much food and, nails and boots do you have where, but how are you moving around with boats and carts and sleds and the like. So anyway, but that's the similarity between all of these games is we're not abstracting supply. We're not talking about supply just in terms of the locations of supply lines and being surrounded or not, or being at too great a distance. We're actually seeing the supplies, the stuff moving around the map and getting used up and replenished.
For sure. So you sent me over a bunch of the art for this, and so I'm showing off the board here now. And something that stands out,
the great Donald Haggerty has been hard at work on Race to Rabaul, as you can see.
Absolutely, and what an artist that guy is. I've loved a lot of the maps he's come up with over the years. But yeah, something that stands out with this, and also with those other Race 2 ones, it looks like tracks in a lot of ways, of like you're moving down these various tracks or up these various pathways. Why is that an important way to model it, that you go from this point to this point?
Right. So as you can see, these are point-to-point maps, which is again a classic thing we're quite familiar with, going, most famously back to Mark Herman with We the People, where we see war game maps that are point to point as opposed to area or hex maps, very, very commonly. So that's what this is. This is a point to point map. It's true of the other race games as well. But the settings that the Phalanx designers chose, and especially France 1944, it's a race because the situation is, in that case, 1944, Falaise Gap, right? The Allies have broken out. They've inflicted a crushing defeat on the German land forces. The Germans are running. They're in retreat back to the Rhine, and the Allies are chasing after them. So it's not necessary to simulate that with a German player. You can have a very simple bot play the German resistance that pops up via some cards that and then the players are all ally and they're racing, right? So the base game for Race to the Rhine, 1944 Race to the Rhine, was a Montgomery player and a Bradley player and a Patton player. And they're each on their own separate tracks, right? They're not enemies. They're out. They're on the same side. They're part of the same allied command structure. So they each have their designated zones with some overlap, right? But they're basically all racing to the Rhine. So that's where you get that tracks aspect. And in 1941 Moscow, they just do that for the Germans in Barbarossa and its army group, North, Center, and South. 3 commanders, and they're racing to conquer Russia. Now, here it's a little bit different in the South Pacific. So for this design, Race to Rabaul, I started with the Phalanx Race 2 system, and then, naturally, I changed what I had to bring us into a different theater, because some of the reasons I'm fascinated by the South Pacific, and I thought the South Pacific would be a great addition to Phalanx's line, is that it's different. First of all, we're at sea. We have maritime lines of communications, shipping lanes and such, and that changes a number of things. And secondly, the Japanese are not exactly on the run here. They are on the defensive. So this is after the most of the big battles on Guadalcanal, and the Allies on on Guadalcanal and on the Kokoda track in New Guinea are on the offensive from the beginning. And the Japanese are launching attacks, but they're spoiling attacks, right? The Japanese in this period never actually took back any major position. They never overran an Allied base or something like that. It's all causing Allied casualties, throwing the Allied attackers off, delaying the loss of the South Pacific to the Japanese Empire. And the Japanese strategy became delay as long as possible the Allied advance and cause as many casualties as possible to prepare for the eventual decisive battle that will happen elsewhere, right? That is, give the empire time to prepare, rebuild, and we'll launch our counterstroke. But this is a defensive operation. So we have a race. We have, MacArthur leading in New Guinea and Halsey leading in the Solomons, and they're each moving up their own track. In this case, there's a green-yellow track and a blue-white track. So you can see New Guinea and Solomons look different because there are two Allied players, green and blue. By the way, I should mention all of this art is provisional, right? This is work in progress. So just a little bit of a look at the sausage being made. If you look closely, you'll notice an error since corrected on this map. And that is at the bottom of the map, the Allied supply bases. In New Guinea, you see two blue diamonds. Those are supposed to be green because that's the green player. And there's two green diamonds in near Guadalcanal. Those are actually blue, right? Now, so this is an older version of the map. Anyway, so don't let that confuse you. But the point is there are tracks here too, but now comes the different thing is the Japanese have a lot of dynamism in their defense. It's an active defense. They're counterattacking. They're actively supplying their forces. And so it's ideal to have Japanese players as well. So what we have is now the base game is opposed play. Two Allied players versus two Japanese players. So much war gamier, if you will, than the logistical puzzles that the Allied players in 44 Rhine are trying to solve. There's an option to have a German player, but it's an option. The main game is it's still competition, but it's a race more than it is a battle. This because of the nature of the Japanese resistance. And here's something that is so interesting about what this system does that isn't in Rabaul that's not in the earlier games. The Allies have a counter logistics strategy. Like they were very effective and very thoughtful at not just directly barging in and attacking these heavily dug in, tenaciously defended Japanese positions, right? They first wore them down. They bomb them, they blockade them, and critically, they would try to sink anything trying to ship Japanese reinforcements and supplies to the frontline positions. And the Allies were very effective at that, exemplified by the Battle of the Bismarck Sea in February 43. So that's a big part of this game. So we have the Allies trying to do counter logistics, which means it's very interesting for the Japanese players to deal with that challenge. How do the Japanese supply, reinforce, and counterattack in the face of this Allied counter logistics effort? Anyway, so like I said, all of that makes this, it's still a race, but it's more of a battle too.
For sure. Speaking about the system, we've been talking about that a little bit, and you've got your own experience in series games with Coin and with Levy and Campaign, and now with your Recon series. But how different has it been for you working in a series that some other designers have come up with?
Yeah, well, it is different, but first of all, I apply the same principles. So I had an article in C3 once about the Coin series called Familiar but Not Samey. And sort of that's kind of an ideal. Like what I look for is if I'm collecting games in a series, let's say, I buy volume 1 and I like it, and now I'm going to get volume 2 and 3. There's a couple of things that are implied in that as a contract with me purchasing series volume 2 and series volume 3. So thing one that's implied is, I think, it's going to be familiar to me, right? I learned a system. I don't want to be starting totally from scratch when I get volume 2. I want to have a leg up understanding the rules and orienting to the new game. On the other hand, it can't be too much the same. Otherwise, why do I need volume 2 if I've got volume 1, right? I'm just, it shouldn't just be a reskin where it's a different map, but basically the gameplay is the same. How should it be different? For me, in a historical board game, critically, how it should be different is it should be transporting me to a different setting, a different time and place. I should feel in the differences within the system, I should feel, aha, now I'm exploring the particular dynamics of this new setting. And that's kind of part of the fun and the excitement. Okay, so from a designer, that's the way I'm proceeding. As I say, I'm going to start with 1944 Race to the Rhine, because I want players who like that game and feel they understand that game, they've learned those rules, to also like Race to Rabaul and feel familiar with Race to Rabaul. On the other hand, not too familiar. I don't want Race to Rabaul to seem like you're in France just with islands, right?
Sure.
I want all those things I talked about that are changing with the purpose of transporting you to the South Pacific in 1943. So I took the same approach in the Coin series, in Levian campaign, and this is familiar to me going back to my first published design, which was Wilderness War, which honestly you could call part of a series of classic CDGs, card-driven games, where I looked, especially for Wilderness War, that was back in, published in 2001, I looked especially at Mark Simonich's Hannibal, Rome versus Carthage, which had bounced very closely off Mark Herman's We the People, and also Ted Racer's Paths of Glory, so very classic designs. I kind of looked at how did they do things and what do I need to change, and only what do I need to change to transport you to the French and Indian War. Okay, that was Wilderness War. It wasn't exactly called a series, but the same approach.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you did that a little bit, maybe with more changes, but with Labyrinth, which uses a lot from Twilight Struggle, right?
Absolutely right. Same exact thing. In fact, that was the initial proposal. I mean, that game Labyrinth, The War on Terror, came out of a conversation with Gene Billingsley of GMT Games at Tempe Expo, and the initial idea was, what if we took Twilight Struggle and we set it in the modern, ideological global conflict of today, which at that time was the War on Terror? What would that look like? And that was the launching point for Labyrinth. Yeah, absolutely.
For sure. Well, going to what's unique about this game, so you've spent a lot of time lately on World War II in the South Pacific, first with Coast Watchers and then with this. What really interests you about that theater and that point in history?
Yeah, so I come out of the same, Grognard tradition. I played squad leader in the 1970s and a lot of other Avalon and Hill games, SPI, GDW. So I ended up playing formatively a lot of World War II. And so it's a comfortable, familiar historical setting from a gaming perspective for me personally, like for many of us older folks anyway. And mainly the European theater, because there was so much more in the European theater. So whenever I got to do something in the Pacific theater in those days, it was a little bit exotic, like I played Upfront a lot. Well, Upfront is Germans versus Russians and Americans initially, then that expanded out. Well, at one point, the expansion was called Banzai, and it was the Japanese in the Upfront system. And I really loved that. It was just it was because it was different, right? It was exotic. And so I kind of that's still kind of in my deep psyche somewhere, that there's this exotic allure to the Pacific theater. And then there are so many great games since then been done with that. And my all-time favorite, all-around favorite war game is Combat Commander Pacific. Specifically the Pacific one. I love Combat Commander in Europe too. But the Pacific one to me just gets you the right amount of it's more refined, I think, product, being second after the first one, and just the right amount of atmosphere. And again, it just transports me to that. So anyway, I'm kind of fascinated within World War II by the Pacific theater. first of all. The South Pacific campaign, much studied campaign, breaking the Bismarck's barrier, Operation Cartwheel, Postern, as we'll do later today in the demo of this game, obviously Kokoda, Guadalcanal, all these famous things. Anyway, it's a very interesting campaign, and it was the main crucible between the Commonwealth allies, U.S. versus Japan, in which the Japanese are forced from the offensive to the defensive, and the allies are shifting to the offensive, right? That is concentrated here. And for that reason, it's just an inherently interesting, because pivotal, campaign. And then we go back to those other things that I kind of came across researching Coast Watchers that have to do with how thorny the logistical problems were for the Japanese because of the Allied counter logistics strategy. So it's just it was a laboratory, I think, at the time for those kinds of strategies in the 20th century, and so a great laboratory for game design for a system that's going to focus on logistics. And wonderfully for meeting Yarrow's proposal to do a game with Phalanx, the research was all in hand for me.
Sure.
Because if Coast Watchers at all, which is going to be, if not already to the printer as we speak, is imminently going to the printer, I'm happy to say. So it's about intelligence work. It's about spying behind Japanese lines and the Japanese launching operations in such a way to thwart Allied warning. And so it's not directly about combat, and certainly not about logistics. However, to take players into the intelligence struggle within the South Pacific in 1942, 1943, which is what Coast Watchers is trying to do, it has to provide this dynamic military environment. That is to say, all these offensives and counteroffensives and strikes going on, all these fascinating campaigns in 1942-43 in the South Pacific, all that military backdrop is necessary to show dynamically somehow to make Coast Watchers make sense, right? If you play Coast Watchers and you're playing the scenario that covers January 1942, it's got to be very different than the scenario for December 1943. So that meant I had to do all the research so I got to know this campaign quite well from a general military and logistical point of view for Coast Watchers. So I had all that, and that led to me, being again fascinated with the logistical challenges and logistical struggles, specifically separate from the intelligence and reconnaissance. And so then it was like, okay, now I can put all that research to work in a pre-existing system that would need to be, of course, evolved to show the South Pacific. So it seemed like I was in a very good position to then very quickly apply the research I already had.
That makes sense for sure. Something else that's interesting here is the particular scale of this game and the players. So a lot of the time, it seems in Pacific games that you'll have somebody, maybe they're focusing on MacArthur and him leading his forces, or they're focusing on Halsey and his leading of his forces on a different track. Or maybe if you zoom way out to the strategic level, you get overall command of both of them. But here, you're much more operational, and yet both of those different commands and different forces are on the map. Why is that important?
Yeah, so this goes back to the race system and what is it about? If it's Phalanx 1940 whatever race to something, what are the player expectations? And I think the expectations are going to be that as you solve your logistical problems, you're going to be racing, you're going to be pressing ahead, and you're trying to do it faster than somebody who's on your same side ostensibly, but is a rival, like Patton and Montgomery, right? So that's what this is trying to. So we're going to focus here on the combined, cooperation and rivalry between MacArthur and Halsey, if you will, each
Mm-hmm.
of those commanders personifying the New Guinea campaign and the Solomons campaign, which are happening at the same time as part of a larger Allied effort. So there's some coordination. And so you're each along your track and you're competing, but you're also cooperating against the Japanese enemy, because if a Japanese commander wins, then MacArthur and Halsey both lose, right?
Mm-hmm.
So then that raises the question, well, how could these two different theaters and theater commanders work together, and how are they really separate, right? They each had their own divisions in play. They largely had their own naval forces dedicated to them. But the air forces, the medium range bombers and the long range bombers available would sometimes help the other side. Certainly there was intelligence sharing. And there might have been, I'm basically presuming in this design that there's also some logistical coordination where, you don't want Halsey to hoard all the landing craft if we need landing craft for an operation in New Guinea, for example. MacArthur's not going to hoard all of the artillery shells, right?
Right.
Some of them, right, and etc. So those are the realms where these two players on the Allied side, representing those two commanders and two tracks, a New Guinea track or theater and a Solomons one, forming part of a single larger campaign, because Cartwheel plan covered all of it, for example, where these two players can either choose to cooperate or not. Okay? We put that in the hands of the players.
Yeah, absolutely. And so obviously that divide's very famous on the Allied side, but you have this represented with two Japanese players as well. Was that same sort of struggle present on the Japanese side?
Well, it was, because famously there was a lack of coordination and an intense competition between the Imperial Japanese Navy and the Imperial Japanese Army. And so, for example, the intelligence sharing among different Allied theater commanders, as far as I've been able to determine, was quite constructive and positive and decisively effective relative to intelligence sharing among Japanese services. Like, they each have their own, intelligence services that are feeding their commands information, and they're seems to a degree hoarding that information rather than sharing it. So that's just one example. But then famously, in terms of what the Navy cares about, what part of the Pacific Ocean is its priority, what are the Army priorities, how much does each care about China versus how much does each care about the U.S. island hopping campaign, and so forth. Now, in this theater, the Navy and the Army are both fighting both in New Guinea and in the Solomons, just like on the Allied side. It's combined arms in both senses. But when you look at the decisions being taken, it seems that there was at least an ostensible division of labor. I don't know to what degree it was formalized, where in this period under Admiral Kusaka, the Imperial Japanese Navy is mainly owning the Solomons effort, and the Imperial Japanese Army under General Imamura is mainly managing and owning the New Guinea effort. And that also makes sense. One's an island chain and one is a very large island with a lot of interior fighting going on in New Guinea, and on the New Guinea mainland, if you will. So we've got a kind of a mainland campaign and an island chain campaign. Kind of makes sense. So on the Japanese side in the game, we allow Navy Admiral Kusaka to personify that player, to personify the Solomons effort by the Japanese, and Army General Imamura to personify the Japanese effort in New Guinea, even though in both cases they have ground, air, and sea forces, of course.
For sure. Let's talk about player count a bit then, maybe. So you've mentioned this is sort of ideal as a 2v2 game, but how else can it work?
So it can go from 2 to 4 players. I don't have, and there won't be in the box, a solitaire system. That said, if the game succeeds, I could foresee officially or unofficially, you certainly could design a solitaire system for that. I'll just say I don't feel like I'm a very talented solitaire game system designer. I do my best, but for me, it was an important opening of a quicker and clearer way forward for Phalanx to agree that we would not initially provide a solitaire system. And that's also a little bit a part of, again, what's different here, right? That this is opposed play. It's what the game is about. And so it really is different in that way than the earlier race games. And hopefully that's a part of not being too samey, right? Anyway, so as I said, yes, you can have 2 Japanese versus 2 Allied players. However, it's easy. I mean, it's easy a transference of the mechanics and the victory conditions to have one player play the Japanese playing both commanders and one player playing the Allies playing both commanders. And you just, your victory is dependent on which of your 2 commanders is doing worse. So it's a very single rule, simply handles that also very easily. So 1v1 is very simple. You also can play 1v2 with the same rules. And so now you've got the advantage for the 2 players who have to both cooperate and compete on one side. They'll get the advantage that the other player has to succeed with both, right? So that works as well. And another mode to play 2 players, and this is a little bit more of a learning game, is you can play all of the scenarios just one side of the map. So if you want to like shrink it down, you can play Kusaka versus Halsey. You're just doing the Solomons, and the game will work. And in fact, one of the scenarios is kind of the learning scenario. The shortest scenario is actually focused just on that, just Kusaka versus Halsey in the Solomons, starting late in the game, starting in November 1943 already, just the kind of the end phase. So you can, if there's just 2 of you, you can kind of bash at it. However, you can take one of the other scenarios and just play the Solomons, or you can take one of the other scenarios and just play New Guinea if you want.
For sure. And you mentioned how the victory conditions change if one person is operating both commanders. But I know in some of the coin ones with sort of team play, when you have one person doing multiple sides, there's also restrictions on how they can transfer resources around that sort of thing. Is that present here as well?
No, not really necessary, in that there are very like I listed how the Allies might cooperate, right? You can airstrike in your allies, in your partner commanders area. Some of your cards like submarines and different things you can use wherever you want. You can share intelligence pretty freely, intelligence cards in the game. For the Japanese, if you look at the map, you'll see there are these little Japanese flags in the kind of the north half of the map. Those are joint defense areas. Once the Allies get up in there, they're close enough to Rabaul that the commanders are able to cooperate more closely in land combat. So those are areas where the 2 commanders can each contribute units to a defense when the Allies are up in there. So those are already all laid out. And other than that, you're winning separately, and your victory depends on how well you do on your track. Okay, as long as one of the other enemy commanders doesn't win first, right? So that's kind of all set, and it will work to the point that if we have one player playing 2 commanders, all we have to say is, well, in that case, you can't just focus on one and ignore the other. Whichever your commanders are doing worse, that's your score.
Yeah, no, I like that. That's interesting. We have a good question here from Mike Smart, Zilla Blitz. Have you looked at sort of a downfall option where you each play one command on each side against each other in 2-player?
I don't have it written, and I'll be honest with you, I never thought of that. And if that's, I can't think of a reason it would not work. And so, once you get the game, you own it, do with it. It's yours to do. Like, that's a cool experiment. I'll have to try that once. I will say for myself, I sometimes struggle with, let me say, role ambiguous assignments. So which game is it? Is it Maria? It's not Friedrich, it's Maria, which is a 3-player game set in the War of Austrian Succession. It's a brilliant, brilliant design, very popular. And if I have it correctly, there's sort of there's like a France Low Countries campaign, and there's a Germany-Austria campaign map. There's like 2 sides of the map with some linkage. And you're playing both. And then one player is playing opposite sides on each map in the coalition. And I have to say that confused me a little bit. Like I couldn't, if I was that player, I was like, well, what am I trying to see happen? It for me was a bit difficult to grasp. And so I don't know if I would personally run into that problem where, am I rooting for the Allies or the Japanese or whatever? I don't know, but it's a cool idea and I've never tried it. I can't think though, I mean, mechanically and by the victory conditions, I guess what it would do is it would wreck cooperation on both sides, wouldn't it? Right? Where now if I'm playing Kusaka in the Solomons, but I'm MacArthur in New Guinea, MacArthur isn't going to give anything to Halsey, right? Yeah. So that's what it would do. It would guarantee that you have the minimum possible cooperation on both sides, which might be cool.
For sure. So another interesting thing with this, you talked about how you came into this system. Do you feel this system can go beyond the now free games here? Do you think there's other parts of World War II or other conflicts in general this Race 2 system could support?
Oh, it absolutely could. So in World War II, let me first say, actually, Yarrow and I have had an extensive exchange about exactly this question and what else is to be done and by whom. And so I'm going to spill those beans, I'll leave that to Yarrow in terms of what he wants to publicize. But the answer is decidedly yes. And so you can imagine many World War II campaigns that involve a lot of movement, particularly if it's one side on the advance during the period that the game is covered. You're going to have logistics in it. And there are several where logistics are quite intense, or where the competition between different commands on the same side for resources is intense. There are many such campaigns. And certainly there are many such campaigns in other parts of history as well. So what I hope Race to Rabaul opens up is we have added maritime logistics, right? So naval affairs from a logistical point of view is a big part of Race to Rabaul that is almost non-existent in the earlier 2 games because they're continental land campaigns, right? So now that we have that, I think there's quite a bit open. Yes, I think I'll leave it there.
Well, and the other thing you mentioned earlier is that you brought this into a setup where it's not entirely one side on the defensive, where the Japanese are at least like they're launching these spoiler attacks, and that's why they're a player role. So it seems like that could open up a lot more campaigns as well, where it's not just one side in a step.
Oh, certainly. So and I will say, so let me talk a little bit about that, the Japanese spoiling attack, what the Japanese players are trying to do here to win the game. So they're trying to hold out they're playing for time. So if they can hold some key spaces that are just called Bismarck's barrier in the game, if they hold those spaces, they're going to be earning medals just for keeping the Allies out of there. So this is part of the other main objective for the Japanese is to cause Allied casualties, and they get medals for that. And they can cause Allied casualties by skillfully defending against Allied attacks, right? Or forcing risky Allied attacks in which the Allies suffer more losses than they would like. And the Japanese win medals that way. They also can win medals by causing casualties by bombing Allied troop positions and by launching these attacks, which in the game I just call bonsai attacks. And the implication of that term bonsai is that the Japanese are going to lose. Whatever they throw into that attack, the Japanese are going to lose. Okay, so they're in effect, they are kind of suicidal. And from the record of Japanese attacks during this period, you're not going to take any ground. You're trying to cause casualties. and wrong-foot the Allies that way. And that latter restriction, that your attacks as the Japanese are not going to recapture any ground, well, that's kind of consistent with the race theme. It's based on the history that I mentioned, that I don't have a case in this period where the Japanese overran a major Allied position in any of these attacks. They were all effectively thwarted. Just the question was, what is the impact on the Allied pace and casualties and supply situation? So we could lift that restriction. We could have a rule, certainly, where just like one side, the Allies in this case, can take a space away in an attack, the other side can take it back. It just becomes more complicated, right? And I felt history didn't justify that, and it isn't needed to add that complication. So it simplifies things that when you're the Allies, one thing you don't have to worry about is losing a base. Once you have established yourself in a map location in that larger area that's represented by the map location at this scale, you've got enough of a garrison there. The Japanese are never going to take it away from you, and that simplifies the gameplay and the rules considerably, right? But we could have a two-way. Maybe it's less of a race, or still a race, but you don't know who's going to push in what direction. Absolutely, where you now introduce a little bit, another wrinkle, right? You make it just a little bit more complicated and therefore more dynamic to enable opposed commanders each to take territory. There's no reason the system can't handle that, right?
For sure. And one last things to talk about. You sent me this historical graphic earlier of the different transportation methods in this period. Maybe just go through this a little bit. Why is this?
Sure.
Why is this an important image?
Right. So as I was, researching Coast Watchers, of course, I was trying to find not just Allied sources, but Japanese sources, and also indigenous local sources. And it's rather more difficult to find Japanese historiography on that war for a number of reasons. But there is some, of course. And so this was one that was particularly compelling to me. It's from a book about Japanese operations in New Guinea in this period, by actually a veteran who became a historian and kind of cultural liaison with New Guinea. His name was Kengoro Tanaka. And in that history, it was very interesting to me for 1943, particularly after the Battle of the Bismarck Sea in February of that year, how much of the difficulty and the concern and the deliberation and the creativity on the Japanese command side had to do with simply reinforcing and supplying their forces, just keeping them from starving, right? So that they could hold the front line and fight, and so this map from that book just shows, for example, how they organized resupply of the Leh Salamaua area in the face of the Allied air threat that vividly was demonstrated in the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. And just so for those of you who aren't familiar with what was the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, it was not a naval battle as such. It was an series of Allied airstrikes against a Japanese troop convoy that was bringing elements of a really experienced division. It was supposed to get to Leh in hopes of doing a counterattack in New Guinea. And instead of making it to Leh with these precious Japanese troops, the convoy is just devastated by Allied air power. And most of those thousands of Japanese personnel, are drowned or actually even shot at sea because the Allies ordered and carried out attacks on shipwrecked Japanese personnel, people bobbing in the water and in rafts and boats and stuff. Anyway, so a brutal affair and a tremendous blow to Japanese command morale, because they realized now within Allied strike range, we cannot safely sail. So they had to come up with, what do we do? So you can build some supply roads, but it's mountainous jungle in New Guinea. It's, you've got to move by sea. even for the operations on the New Guinea mainland, and certainly for any island garrisons. And so what this map shows is that they're doing their resupply into ports that are kind of out of that immediate Allied strike range, like Rabaul itself or Madang in New Guinea. But then from there on, they have to rely on some kind of special means. Maybe fast destroyer runs, but even those are becoming like the Tokyo Express, famously in the Solomons, which was trying to beat this problem with a different tactic. But even those destroyers are becoming too vulnerable. Barges become essential, and then a nice supplement to the barges, but never a lot of volume, is submarine transport. That's shown here as well. And there's a lot of discussion in Tanaka's text of, you know, how they organized this and how it was doing and everything. And of course, the Allies on the other side are very much trying to break this system, this logistical system. But it's all a kludge. It's not adequate. You know, it's just what the Japanese are doing as best they can in the face of Allied counter-logistics power. So I thought, you know, that is such a great thing to bring out. If I can bring that out, you know, in a game, it would be a fascinating study. And by the way, so when I watch players, you know, playing the game, I do watch for how much do the Allies actually do that, right? Because of course it's up to you how you run your war. How much do they try to bomb and starve out Japanese frontline positions and knock out their convoys and take down their transport fleet first before they launch the big attack? Or do they, in racing with the other players, do they undertake risky attacks against, you know, well-entrenched and possibly well-garrisoned Japanese positions, you know, because the theory behind the game is the Allied counter-logistics focus worked. So try that, right? But it's not always obvious to players. So it's kind of a cool experiment to run each time.
For sure. A second to last question for you. So we've got an image up here of you demoing this at SDHistCon Summit in November now. And so you've been demoing this a lot face-to-face on TTS as well, I know. What has changed about this from the demoing and playtesting process?
So there's been a good deal of tuning of the combat system to be balanced, to make sure that the different cards, there are a variety of different cards, and some of them they're bonus actions in the system, but think of them as events that allow you to do special things, including special kinds of attacks. So making sure those cards are balanced against each other, you know, any given card being not too potent or too little potent. The decks themselves contain a spread of hidden firepower and unit strengths that you can use to reinforce battles. It's very critical that balance were correct, both for gameplay and history. So there's tuning of that. And then there are 4 scenarios in the game. And so setting up at different points in the 1943 campaign. And so to make sure that those are within historical bounds, also balanced among not just 2 players, but 4 players, right? And ideally tested for not just 4 players or 2 players, but 2 players on this half of the map, 2 players on that half of the map, 3 players, etc. So testing as best we can, you know, it's never perfect, of course, as best we can, testing scenario setup, balance. And now, and this was true already by this time in San Diego, really were physical tests of the art, because you know, I have made very, very few mechanical changes in the last months. The game is already an art, and I feel like it's performing as I want. But it's one thing to look at a draft game board on the screen. It's another thing to print it out, put pieces on and markers on it, and actually play and see. You know, so a lot of working with Donal on, you know, this color isn't clear enough, this space isn't big enough. You know, user interface issues, right? So we test that on Tabletop Simulator, as by the way, we will later today, because that'll be a test too, but also physical.
Absolutely. And yes, we'll have that demo coming up in just over an hour at 11 Pacific. Thank you so much for your time here, Volko. I really
Thank you, Andrew.
appreciate this. And just a last thing, is there any other designs you have in the pipeline that you want to plug?
Oh yes, always. So as I mentioned, Coast Watchers
Mhm.
is at or imminently headed to the printer. That's volume 1 in the Recon series from GMT Games. Also Hunt for Blackbeard, which uses some similar mechanics from Fort Circle Games. That is delivery pending. It's produced. I think it's now a matter of just logistics of getting it from the printing plant to market. So that's coming. And then in the Recon series for GMT, volume 2 is already on P500. And so the Recon series, which is mainly about hidden information, the Coast Watchers is the South Pacific 1942-43. Volume 2 is called Drachen and is about the Battle of Verdun and the reconnaissance struggle, mainly over the trenches, the aircraft versus balloons and things like that. And you play out offensives during the Battle of Verdun with an important factor being, where do you hide what, and how are you able to discover and target what your enemy has hidden beyond no man's land? So that's called Drachen. And then in that series, the Recon series, volume 3 already exists in playable prototype. I showed it to Gene in San Diego. Volume 4, what will probably be volume 4 by another designer, already exists in playable prototype, and we have at least a concept for volume 5.
Wow, that's amazing. And that's all very cool. Well, thank you again, Volko. We really appreciate it. Again, in just over an hour, Volko will have a demo of this. Coming up next for the con, we've got 3 events at 10 Eastern. We have Ricardo, who is here in the chat. He is running his very special tank duel session from that historic location in Italy he was talking about earlier. We have Morgane running Hubris, a demo of her game Hubris, Twilight of the Hellenistic World. And over here on the SDHist YouTube channel, I'll be talking to Mark Herman about his design, Army of the Potomac. He's going to be demoing that. Yeah, that guy, indeed. Well, thank you again to Volko, and thank you to everyone who came to this one. And have a great time at SDHist Winter Quarters.